Both Brandon Nimmo and David Stearns met with the media on Monday to talk about the blockbuster trade that sent Nimmo to the Rangers. What did we learn from Nimmo, and what do we learn about what's next for the New York Mets?
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the number one sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to be talking about what was said now that the Brandon Nimmo trade is official. Nimmo spoke with the Rangers media, and so I'm going to break down what he said about how the deal came together and why he ultimately decided to waive his no-trade clause. We'll go through that in the first segment. In the second segment, we're going to talk about how David Stearns views the trade. Why did he pull the trigger for the Mets? And then in the final segment, we'll continue with Stearns' comments on what is next for the Mets this offseason. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the number one daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you're going to get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Download FanDuel today. All right, so we'll start off with Brandon Nimmo's comments, but to kind of lead into it, David Stearns was asked about how this trade came together. So he gave us a timeline from his perspective, and he said throughout the offseason, the Rangers had looked at Nimmo as an attractive fit for them. The Mets had felt the same way about Marcus Semien, and the dialogue really started to pick up at the GM meetings. They came to terms on a deal, and then on Thursday night, he brought the idea of trading or the idea of the trade to Nimmo, and that's what Nimmo describes to the media. Nimmo said that he gets that call on Thursday night. He was taken aback. He asked a bunch of questions, and then essentially the final one was, am I the only thing that is standing in the way of this trade? Which David Stearns, of course, said yes. Everything is pretty much in place. They would just have to dot the T's or dot the I's, cross the T's, and get everything put together. But if Nimmo waived the no-trade clause, a deal was agreed on. So then Nimmo said, all right, well, it's my daughter's first birthday tomorrow. I need some time to talk with my family to think this thing over. And so they had their birthday celebration. And then Nimmo said from Friday night all the way through Sunday afternoon, he was on the phone nonstop, talking to, sounds like, everybody he could in the Rangers organization. And this is where you start to see how everything came together and how what seemed like an impossible task, which was trading a guy who not only does he talk about the fact that if he had stayed with the New York Mets, as I pointed out on the show, and I'm sure many others have as well, if he had played out the contract, number 9 could be hanging in the rafters. That is not an easy thing to just walk away from. The legacy you've built with one team. He even mentioned it would be me and David Wright as the only ones who have done that, who have played their entire career with the Mets organization. And so that was a big thing to, again, move on from. He also talked about the fact that they had just finished their house in Port St. Lucie, that it took 3 years to build, even mentioned how his parents had moved to Port St. Lucie. Brandon Nimmo was setting up his life, and rightfully so, around being a New York Met for the rest of his career. That house he mentioned was supposed to be a place to host team functions and dinners the way that they've been hosting those events organized by Nimmo at PopStroke the last couple of years. He wanted to have a place where he could bring the team to this new home that he had built. And now his spring training is going to take place in Arizona. So there was so many different things and layers that he had to work through to make this make sense. But what the Mets essentially did was they came to terms on the deal. And then they presented it to Nimmo, and what they said to Nimmo, which I do think is true, is that they were not necessarily shopping Brandon Nimmo, but the Rangers were really eager to bring him in. And I think it's a little bit of a gray area. We're the New York Mets calling all 30 teams saying, can you please give me Brandon, or can you please take Brandon Nimmo off of my books? No. But I think based on the season that they had, and we'll talk about this more when we get into David Stearns' comments, the Mets went into GM meetings and anything before that saying that they were open for business, that I'm sure the three untradables in the organization, Juan Soto, Francisco Lindor, and Nolan McLean, and everything else theoretically was on the table. And so when you put that out there and then you get a team like the Rangers that says, man, we would love to have Brandon Nimmo in our organization. You have Chris Young, their president of baseball operations, who had some overlap with Nimmo in the Mets organization. You have Jacob deGrom. They're talking about it. They're thinking about it. They're trying to find a landing spot for Marcus Semien. The idea gets kicked around. It gets some legs. And then this is how it all comes together. And so the Mets, to get Nimmo to waive the no trade, convey that this is the Rangers who really want him. And then it's up to Nimmo to talk to the Rangers, and it's up to the Rangers to sell him on the fact that he is wanted and that he can win. That was a big thing for Nimmo. He said as much as the personal accolades are great and having that jersey number retire would have been awesome, ultimately, he said the Mets would not have brought this trade to me if they did not think that it put the Mets in the best position to win moving forward. And he said that, again, they made it extremely apparent that they weren't actively shopping me, but the Rangers really wanted me. And for him, it was about making sure that the Rangers wanted to win too. Because ultimately, the way this trade was presented to Nimmo and how everything came together and how he's viewing it, and I think rightfully so, because I think it is the truth, both of these teams had these guys that were ingrained in the fabric of their clubhouse and their culture. Nimmo, way more than Semien, just by virtue of a longer career with the club, but Marcus Semien was the Rangers captain. Okay, so these are guys that are well-respected, that a lot of people in these organizations love. And so to move on for them is tough, but I think for both teams, they felt like this restructuring was something that was going to allow them to build a better group for the 2026 season and beyond, and would allow both teams to win moving forward. And that's what Brandon Nimmo was sold on. He also talked to Jacob deGrom, and deGrom, raved about his experience with the Rangers. So I don't think that deGrom's going to get traded to the Mets after this. I think deGrom is probably pretty happy where he is. And those two guys get to be teammates again. Also, Travis Jankowski, who was Nimmo's teammate in 22? And then this past season, he has now become the outfield coach and I think first base coach for the Rangers. So there's some familiarity there. Spoke with Skip Schumacher and ultimately decided this was an exciting new chapter of his career. The Rangers want him to be a leader. They talked about the fact that they did so much background on the person as much as the player, and they want him to be that authentic person that can be a mentor to their young hitters, particularly the young outfielders. They got Evan Carter and Wyatt Langford in that outfield with them, and really have him be an instrumental part at helping this young core get to the next level. And so when you really see how it is all laid out to Nimmo, why would he want to stay somewhere that he was not wanted, a team that wanted to trade him? Despite all the love and affection he has for the New York Mets, their fans, having a life set up in Port St. Lucie, and the only organization that he's ever known, that team still decided that they would be better with Marcus Semien instead of Brandon Nimmo, or at least moving forward, that the way that this trade impacts them, that this is the best thing for the Mets. And you have a team on the other side that desperately wants you, that believes you are the piece that can help them get to the next level. And that's how this whole thing comes together. It's really weird to see Brandon Nimmo interacting with the Texas media, and they already love him because he is Brandon Nimmo, the same authentic person, the just great guy that we've watched throughout his career. And so you see him interacting with them. It's going to be a good fit for Nimmo. I think he's going to really enjoy this next chapter of his career. And in some ways, of course, you're always going to root for Brandon Nimmo, at least I am, that he finds a lot of success and he has a great next chapter in his career. And there's still that sadness when he talks about being a Met, when he talks about his house, all that stuff. To me, it's still a little gut-wrenching, right? Like, man, like the Mets couldn't have figured this out. They couldn't have found a way to win with Brandon Nimmo. They had to get rid of a guy that had a chance to be a lifelong Met. And I think at the end of the day, you have to remove that sentiment and think, what is the best thing for the New York Mets? What is the best thing for the Texas Rangers? And both these organizations decided this was the best thing for them, and they were able to convince Nimmo, who had a say in the matter because he had that no trade clause, that this was the best thing for his career. And so the Rangers were able to sell Nimmo, and Nimmo seems pretty excited about what's coming up for him in Texas. So I'm happy for Nimmo. I'm a little sad about the ending still, that the heart as a Mets fan still, it feels a little bit weird about the whole thing. But I think the more and more that we're removed from the shock of, wow, they just traded Brandon Nimmo, the more you can start to wrap your head around it and say, all right, this does set the Mets up to be a different team in 2026 and potentially a much better team with what they might do now that some of that future money is not tied up and they can maybe be a little more aggressive on the market, and they have opened up a spot in the corner outfield to potentially pursue other, top free agents, trade targets to maybe make this a completely different team this upcoming season. We're going to talk next about what David Stearns said, because there was a lot of interesting tidbits on how he felt about this deal and Nimmo, and then also what he thinks the Mets are going to do moving forward, or what he would comment on the Mets plans moving forward. So we're going to go through everything David Stearns said here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of the game or you just want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at an even bigger payout. It just keeps every game interesting and exciting, especially when your team is making that late push and you can ride along with them. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when you put down your first $5 bet and it wins. So again, you put down a $5 bet. If it wins, you are going to get $300 in bonus bets. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 15,000 subscribers. I would love to get there by the end of the year. Honestly, we're getting so close. I'd love to get there by Thanksgiving on Thursday. Really do appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. So let's talk about what David Stearns said. His presser came first before Nimmo's. And I think, again, he laid out some of the timeline of the events, and he just paid proper respect to Brandon Nimmo first and foremost, talked about him being the ultimate pro, how from the point that he was drafted all the way through his Mets tenure, Brandon Nimmo did everything that was asked of him and was just exactly what you would have wanted in a New York Met. He talked about how, the fan side of it, that was one part of making it difficult to trade him, just that the fan reaction and the fan sentiment. But he even said that even more than that, beyond the fan relationships, he talked about just the dynamics of having Nimmo ingrained in the fabric of the New York Mets and how there are relationships throughout every facet of the organization that Nimmo has. And so parting with him and some of the internal relationships made that trade so much harder. And he talked about Nimmo's authenticity, how that was one of his greatest traits, how this is just a guy who is, what you see is what you get, and how much they appreciated having him around. But, quote, at the end of the day, I still felt this was the right decision for the organization. He said it's not changing the clubhouse dynamics. It's not about changing the clubhouse dynamics. It is a recognition that what we did last year wasn't good enough, and running back the exact same group was not the right thing to do. He said, we believed and still believe that we have to be open to anything. And that's what I was mentioning in the last segment. I think the Mets looked at what happened and they said, all right, in the couple years that David Stearns has been in charge and this front office was put together, 2024, it was a filling out year. They were filling out the organization. They were not going to be the biggest spender on the market outside of trying to pursue Yoshinobu Yamamoto. And once that didn't happen, they felt, all right, this is not a free agent market for us to be going all in on. We are going to find some reclamation projects, try to rebuild this rotation, see what happens. They end up going all the way to Game 6 of the NLCS. after that magical season, it was all right. Well, how do we take this team and refine it, retool it, but keep the winning components together and try to go for a World Series in 2025? They made some wrong choices. They brought back Jesse Winker and Ryan Stanek when maybe they should have brought back Phil Maton and Harrison Bader. They invested in Sean Manaea instead of Luis Severino, and they let Jose Quintana go, and Manaea had the worst season of the three. It just did not work for the New York Mets. It was a year where a lot went wrong. And so after going through it, and Stearns mentioned how day-to-day in season, you're not thinking as much about what's next. You're just trying to win tonight and try to make it to the playoffs. And when that ended and you have to do your reflection and sort of your autopsy on what went wrong, that's where it came down to the point where the Mets, again, had to be open to anything. They had to go into this offseason and not take anything off the table. And when you do that and you open yourself up to, hey, we're going to listen on anything. If you want to trade for Brandon Nimmo, we're going to hear you out. As long as you're not asking about Juan Soto or Francisco Lindor or, again, probably Nolan McLean, yeah, we'll entertain it. I think if there was a team that was gung-ho on acquiring David Peterson, the Mets would be open to that, because if that other team was motivated to acquire Peterson, was going to put a piece on the table that fit the Mets more, they would pull the trigger, because they can't just say, all right, we love Brandon Nimmo. We can't afford to lose this guy as such a big part of the fabric of our team. They have to look at it objectively and say, okay, Brandon Nimmo is going to his age 33 season. There's 5 years left on that deal. We have a hole at second base because Jet Williams might not be big league ready yet. We don't know if he's going to be able to win the opening day job. We think Jeff McNeil is another expendable piece, and he's better as a bench piece than our everyday second baseman. We want to improve our defense. We have a chance to get Marcus Semien, bring him in. We like the player. We can shave off 2 years of a long-term contract, go from a 5-year deal with Nimmo to a 3-year deal in Semien, change up and get a new leader who's going to have a similar impact on the clubhouse, but with a different voice, and just change up the course so it's not just the same team trying to climb that same mountain again. And when you go through it all and you think about, okay, what are alternatives on the market at second base? Okay, Jorge Polanco, that's about it. Okay, Jeff McNeil, probably the best option the Mets could have, unless they're going to trade for Brendan Donovan, who has more interest right now, according to reports, than any other piece on the trade market, because what team could not use a Brendan Donovan, sort of a younger, supercharged version of Jeff McNeil in some ways, right? If it's going to cost that much to get him or get Ketel Marte, to get a second baseman that could start on opening day and improve your defense and provide some pop from the second base position, there weren't a lot of options. Semien made a lot of sense. When it comes to a corner outfield spot, well, you can go big game hunting for Kyle Tucker. You can look at Cody Bellinger. So ultimately, for restructuring their team, for what it allows them to do next, this was what they think is the best thing for this organization. When it comes to Marcus Semien and what he brings to the table, David Stearns was asked about the bat. He said it is notable that this is a player who can contribute to winning in multiple different ways, and the bat may not lead the way at this point in his career. He said, we think there is going to be some bounce back in his offensive game, but what we are counting on at the top of his skill set are contributions he can make defensively, how he can perform on the bases, and we think those are going to help us win games. Having Francisco Lindor, Marcus Semien up the middle, you are going to watch some of the best middle infield defense you have ever seen with a pair of Mets infielders. These guys are going to be awesome together, and having Marcus Semien at second base does hedge a little bit of concerns if you bring Pete Alonso back defensively, because Semien has such great range. That can allow you to have Pete Alonso really get into his head. All right, you don't have to worry about going to your right much. You don't have to worry about trying to cover a bunch of ground. Guard the line and play first base and just be the best defender you can be at helping the rest of your infielders. And Semien and Lindor and Brett Beatty can do a lot of the heavy lifting. So that's part of it. Also, how he can perform on the bases, Marcus Semien scores a lot of runs. When he gets on base, he converts a lot of those opportunities. Now, part of that, of course, is the guys that are hitting behind you. And Semien was at the top of the lineup a lot. So he would have some good hitters sitting right behind him. Who knows if he's going to be at the top of the Mets lineup? I would sort of hope that he's not, but I do think that this is a guy that will steal bases, that will go first or third, that will score from first on a double, that would do a lot of the little things that will help the New York Mets win. He also talked about the player and the person. He said, this is someone who takes his craft extremely seriously. He does everything he can to get in the lineup. This, again, was a leader on the Rangers, their captain. So you're replacing the ultimate teammate in Nimmo with another ultimate teammate in Semien. And I think, again, this is why this became such a win-win trade for both of these sides. When he was asked about Semien blocking other young players at second base, David Stearns says, quote, I think the good thing about the players who have played second base for us is that there's a ton of positional versatility for all of them. We have a high degree of confidence that these guys can play multiple positions. He said he does not view this as blocking anyone from playing time. I think that that's really interesting because the more that I've thought about this trade, the more I can understand how this is not locking in second base for the next 3 years, and anybody who proves to be better than Marcus Semien, it doesn't matter. They have no shot at being the Mets second baseman, and they also have no chance of getting on the field. You have to trade Jeff McNeil. You have to trade Jet Williams. We're going to talk about McNeil more in the next segment because I thought the comments that Stearns made about McNeil were very interesting. But when it comes to Jet Williams, the more I'm thinking about it, you can have Jet Williams now get a full year of development in AAA. You don't need Jet Williams to make it up to the big leagues at 22 years old. It's okay if Jet Williams needs a little bit of time to be the best version of himself. And if you don't start that service time clock right away, okay? Jet Williams still has more in his game that he can unlock. And spending a year in Syracuse is not the worst thing. And you know what? If Jet Williams is down in AAA and he's got a 950 OPS and he's tearing the cover off the ball, they can find a spot on the field for him. They can find an outfield spot. There's bound to be an injury. This is a very versatile player that can find his way onto the diamond. And the same thing goes for Luisangel Acuna in some respects, although I think he is more expendable, as we talked about in yesterday's show, after this trade than I think his standing on the roster is now the most tenuous in my eyes because there's no options to put him in Syracuse and because a lot of his value is his ability to play an elite defense at second base, and they just got a guy that can do that. So Acuna maybe set aside, but again, theoretically, he could play third, he could play center. I'm sure they could stick him in left and it would be fine. Brad Beatty can play third. Ronnie Mauricio can play third. So when you think about all these guys that could have played second base, they do have other ways to get on the field, and the best 9 guys will get in the lineup, and injuries are going to make it a reality that you're going to need far beyond just 9 guys to get through a season. So having some depth, we always think, oh man, how are you going to get all these guys in the lineup? And that's never been a problem ever. Or when it is one of the rarest of things when you have a team where there's just too many good players and you can't find playing time. More often than not, things will happen, opportunities will arise, and these guys will get on the diamond. So really looking at this trade and what it means for the New York Mets, you are getting a different look in the clubhouse. You're getting a new face that can be can offer a different perspective to this team on how to win. A guy that has won a World Series, mind you, who plays a position of need for the Mets that gives them an upgrade on opening day, and you see what happens from there. If Marcus Semien proves to not be a good player anymore, the New York Mets have the luxury of getting out of that deal if they have to, and it'll be easier to get out of that deal when there's only 2 years left after this season than it would have been if Brandon Nimmo was on the Mets, had a disastrous 2026 campaign, and you still had 4 years left. So the Mets opened up flexibility. They made a big change in the clubhouse. They brought a guy that they think can help them win in a lot of different ways, and they opened up a lot of possibilities, and that's where we're going to close out the show. He talked about Jeff McNeil. Stearns talked about Alonso and Diaz. He talked about the Mets outfield as a whole, and he talked about how far they can stretch the payroll. So I want to get to all of that stuff here in just a minute. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On yesterday's show, I talked about Jeff McNeil, and I explained why I actually felt like this trade made McNeil more likely to remain with the Mets than less. I felt that even though on the surface you could say, oh, well, Marcus Semien is a second baseman, Jeff McNeil becomes more expendable. The way I viewed it, the New York Mets were in a position where they could not run back the same team. And Jeff McNeil was the easiest piece to move because Brandon Nimmo had this no trade clause that I didn't think he was going to waive. You had Pete Alonso, who I felt like the Mets really needed to bring back. And so if you brought back Pete and you couldn't move off of Nimmo, well, then McNeil was the one guy that you look to and say, all right, well, I guess we get rid of Jeff. But now that Nimmo's gone, you have already shaken the core of this team. And even if you bring Pete Alonso back, Jeff McNeil makes a lot of sense on this roster. I think he makes more sense on this roster now than he did prior to the trade because all of a sudden, Jeff McNeil is not going to be counted on to be the Mets starting second baseman. He can do what he does best, which is bring that versatility to the table, and he can be a high-end bench piece where, hey, if anything goes wrong, guess what? You have a really good two-win player, and that's a good thing to have a guy that just is not a negative. He's going to bring positive value to with his bat. He's not going to be a below average hitter. He's not going to be a below average defender wherever you put him. He's just a passable, solid baseball player at whatever spot that you find for him. And so I really felt like the more that I sort of thought about the deal, Jeff McNeil sticking around makes sense because why are you going to just eat down the contract just to flip him and get nothing back of value? And when you hear the way David Stearns talks about Jeff McNeil, it certainly seems like they're planning to keep him. He said, Jeff, by virtue of our positional versatility, still has the ability to impact our team in a variety of ways. So what exactly that is going to look like is probably going to have to wait until the rest of the offseason unfolds. Certainly his ability to play the corner outfield spots. There may be some days where we give Semien a blow and play him at second. We may ask Jeff to play first, depending on how the offseason pans out. I talked to Jeff yesterday. He understands where we are heading. He wants to be part of this, and he understands his positional versatility is a real asset for us. So the fact that David Stearns called up Jeff McNeil yesterday after the trade was announced, probably said, hey, I know you're probably wondering what your future is. We want you to be part of the New York Mets if you want to stick around and be part of this. And it says Jeff McNeil wants to be part of the team. So I really think that the Mets have probably already canvassed the league on Jeff McNeil, talked to these other GMs, and they probably have an idea of what it would take to move Jeff McNeil. Now, if things fall into place where the Mets have got Cody Bellinger, they got Pete Alonso back, and they are looking at their team and they just think, Bellinger already gives us a lot of the versatility. We can't find a trade we like on Luis Angel Acuna, and we'd rather hold on to Acuna for our bench instead of Jeff McNeil. Maybe they would make a move on McNeil. I wouldn't rule it out. But ultimately, for a team that's trying to win in 2026, having a high-end bench piece, even an overpriced one, with the contract and Jeff McNeil, it actually makes a lot of sense, and it hedges a lot of concerns in so many different spots where now you can pursue free agents knowing I got a fallback in-house. It's not a great fallback if the New York Mets don't re-sign Pete Alonso and Jeff McNeil is your starting first baseman, but you also have Mark Vientos. You also have Ryan Clifford. So it just gives you a placeholder and an option that you can go to. And if they don't bring back Pete Alonso, my assumption would be, they actually signed Kyle Schwarber. And so now they have this high-end DH in Schwarber. Maybe Vientos is the first baseman in theory, but if Vientos doesn't hit and looks awful at the position, well, you have Jeff McNeil. If Juan Soto or Cody Bellinger or whoever, or Carson Benge, if one of those guys gets hurt, Jeff McNeil can slide into the outfield. I just think, and Marcus Semien, he's 35 years old. He just had an injury where he fouled a ball against his foot. You never know what's going to happen. If he goes out, you have Jeff McNeil. So I really think at this point, it seems like Jeff McNeil is going to stick around, which is funny because there is a world where Jeff McNeil will outlast not only Brandon Nimmo, that's already been decided, but he might outlast Pete Alonso. He could outlast Edwin Diaz on the Mets roster. And there's a chance that next year Jeff McNeil is the one guy from prior to the Cohen era that is still in place, which is wild, but it very well could happen. I don't think it will, though, because he was asked, David Stearns was, about Diaz and Alonso. And the first reporter that asked him the question just really hasn't been paying attention to David Stearns and how he's answered these questions to the media. So he asked, how do you feel about Diaz and Alonso and their free agencies? How have these negotiations gone? When have you talked to these guys? And Stearns, whenever you ask him about a negotiation for a free agent, because for one, he's not supposed to speak on it anyway, he's always going to say, I can't talk about negotiations with a free agent. So he says, love them, can't talk about negotiations. Anthony DiComo was brilliant. I got to give him credit. He asks a follow-up and says, is it possible that the Mets will re-sign Diaz, Alonso, and get a big outfield bat in free agency? David Stearns goes on to say, with our ownership group as Steve, he has shown that we are willing, or that he is willing, they're willing to support what we feel is right from a baseball perspective. Payroll space is not unending, but I'm also very confident that we're going to have the support we need and showing the resources we need to put a good team on the field. DiComo then asks a brilliant follow-up. He says, could you see a scenario where you have an offseason like the one that I described? And then David Stearns says, sure. And goes on to explain how they're not going to take anything off the table at this time, and they are going to explore all avenues to get better. So that gives you a little bit of an inkling on why this trade made sense for the New York Mets. The way I view it, if Brandon Nimmo can't be a lifelong Met because now Pete Alonso is going to be one, I'm happy with this trade, because what this did is it allowed the Mets to free up long-term spending. You can only have so many players on your roster locked into a $20, $30 million salary slot. And the Mets have Juan Soto in a $50 million range. So he's basically like two-star players on your books. You have Lindor. You have Soto. Moving forward, that is 51 plus 33 and change after the deferred money for. It's basically $85 million per year on those two players. You add in Nimmo, you were always starting off at $100 million on three guys. Now you bring in Alonso in a long-term deal. Maybe Alonso gets the AAV a little bit higher, but you still have the ability to now have Alonso in the books and not just be set for the rest of this decade of a core of Lindor, Soto, Alonso, and Nimmo when their first year together as the Fab Four did not work. So you move on from Nimmo, and I think that does make it a lot more likely that Pete Alonso is coming back and re-sign with the New York Mets. And I think if the Mets do re-sign Pete Alonso, that is going to be a huge moment for the fan base. If it is a 5-year deal, which I hope that they aren't afraid to go to that lengths to bring back Pete Alonso, I think that is going to outweigh the negative or the upset sentiment that the fans have right now about losing Nimmo. If they get to celebrate the fact that Pete Alonso is going to be trying to chase down 500 home runs in a Mets uniform, I think that excitement is going to outweigh any leftover resentment about Nimmo not being a Met anymore. So I really am looking at that now as the top priority for the New York Mets. Edwin Diaz, obviously they'd love to have him back, but I think the only way this works is if you bring back Pete, because you bring back Pete, you got Semien next to him, so I think you can feel a lot better about the defense on the right side of your infield. And then you explore that outfield market. I will say, if the Mets were to sign Kyle Tucker, which I think is the least likely of some of the options we'll be talking about on tomorrow's show, if they go to that level to get a guy like Tucker, you might not have as much to have Pete Alonso and Tucker together on this team, or you might not be as willing to commit the years to Pete, and you might want to go in a different direction where maybe they acquire a first baseman via trade that has less years of team control. Maybe they are okay with Mark Vientos at first base and having Jeff McNeil as that other option. We'll see how it all comes together, but the Mets are certainly going to be aggressive in trying to retain their two guys and also looking at the market and trying to find a replacement now for Brandon Nimmo in the outfield. when asked about where the outfield is, he said it'd be too early to determine how our outfield alignment is going to shape up. He said we got Juan Soto. Tyrone Taylor's coming back. We're really excited about that. We got some young players who can contribute. Once again, he gave Carson Benge another pat on the back, like, hey, you're our guy. He said Carson Benge is going to play, flat out. Carson Benge is going to play. He said, we think Jeff is a contributor. Jet Williams can play well out there as well, talking about the outfield. And so it's going to be a competition for playing time with all of these guys. But I do think adding an outfielder completes this team. If you bring back Pete and you get a upgrade defensively over Nimmo, whether you put that upgrade in left or in right, move Soto over, that gives you about the same offensive production as Nimmo. You just get a more complete player like a Cody Bellinger, like if you went on the trade market and got a center fielder in Jarren Duran. All of a sudden, I think this is a better team. And so that's what the Mets are going to push towards. Ultimately, when you hear the comment about the resources for the payroll, when you hear the Mets saying anything's on the table, this is going to be a massive offseason. And I think in a lot of ways, this is David Stearns' offseason to prove that he is able to win in a big market, that he's able to make the right decisions and pull in the right players to build a winning team in this market. And really, this is his opportunity to make this his team. I don't think the New York Mets have been a team in David Stearns' image over the first 2 years. And it's because of decisions made by the past regime. The decision to extend Jeff McNeil, the decision to sign Brandon Nimmo to an 8-year contract. These were decisions made by Billy Epler after the 2022 season. If David Stearns was the Mets president of baseball operations after that 2022 season, Brandon Nimmo is probably not a Met, and I don't think Jeff McNeil would have gotten an extension. And so now you are going to see Stearns build a team the way he wants to, with that premium defense, probably with some more speed. And we're going to see a team that I think looks a lot different next year. And I don't think that is a bad thing. I think we're going to see a completely revitalized version of the New York Mets. But I do hope that they still can honor the fans by bringing back a guy that is not part of the problem, a guy who his data suggests that this past season, he wasn't trending down. Pete Alonso was trending up. And so I think if you bring back Pete Alonso, I think you will do enough fan service that even if you don't bring back Edwin Diaz, as long as you bring back one of the two, but I think particularly for Pete Alonso, to still have a homegrown Met at the center of this whole thing, I think that is the way that they can thread the needle of this, where Mets fans are still really exciting and willing to embrace this new club. Yeah, granted, if they go out and they make some big moves and Kyle Tucker is a New York Met, fans are going to be excited regardless. But there is something to be said about having a homegrown Met at the center of it all and what that means to fans. And that's why I think Pete Alonso stuck within the Mets maybe did go up as a result of all of this. But that's all I got on the two press conferences and what we learned from Brandon Nimmo as he got introduced from the Rangers and David Stearns explaining the trade. On tomorrow's show, I do want to start to get into those outfield options. I'm not entirely sure yet if I want to do a separate show on Jarren Duran or include him in the show where I'm talking about Bellinger and Tucker. So we're definitely going to look at some outfield options that we maybe haven't explored yet this offseason and how that could impact the Mets roster moving forward if those are the players that they ultimately try to pursue, which is the best one, all that good stuff. As always, appreciate you all for tuning into the show. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider and be part of our Texan service, go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets.